was by calling an insurance policy. By the way, the way it worked was, if the borrower defaults, the insurer makes good on the debt. So now you don't have to worry when you lend money to somebody because you have an insurance policy in case the borrower defaults. In order to get around all the regulations that come from the Great Depression about insurance, since it is a fundamentally corrupt enterprise, there are commissions. In every state all 50 states have a commission to control insurance. So the way that the AIG company got around this was by giving insurance, these are not complicated ideas by the way, by calling it something else. Instead of calling the insurance policy an insurance policy, the brilliant idea was call it something else. So the name was invented, a credit default swap, which is an insurance policy. It's just not called that, and therefore there is no regulation that you have to subordinate yourself to. So the AIG Corporation wrote insurance policies for every debt in the world. And when the debts began to collapse in 2008, all the people stuck with a debt that they couldn't collect on, all the creditors, went to the AIG Corporation and said, give me. And the AIG Corporation smiled at them and said, we'd love to help you, but we don't have the money. And then they said something very American. Have a nice day. And at this point, it was discovered that every state in the Union had invested the money for the pensions of its workers in these debt instruments. Many European banks and governments had done that. Even little villages in Norway had put their firemen's benefit fund in these instruments, and they all wanted the AIG Corporation to pay. And the AIG Corporation couldn't. So the United States took over the AIG Corporation, which it owns now. Let me make that clear. The largest insurance company in the world is a corporation of the United States government, and it will not end anytime soon. I'll do much more of this analysis of the United States tomorrow evening, but I want you to understand that the government of the United States stepped in and is now massively funding and supporting the private enterprise system of the United States, which is really only half a private enterprise system. The banks remain dependent on the government. The insurance industry remains dependent on the government. Our largest automobile company is an automobile company, General Motors, of the United States government, and that's only the beginning of a long story. 95% of all mortgages, if you buy a home in the United States, nobody pays with their own money. The only people who do that are movie stars, sports athletes, and gangsters. Nobody else has the money. Everybody else borrows. Those are overlapping categories, but that's a different. They borrow. And 95%, in the last 2.5 years, 95% of mortgages that are loans made by banks to people buying homes are immediately sold by the banks to the United States government. If it weren't for the government buying those mortgages, no bank would make the mortgage loan. In other words, the entire housing market, which is a fifth of our economy, is now a government-supported, government-financed operation. Okay. So what have we got? We have got a massive demonstration of the dysfunction of the private sector. A massive demonstration that to save capitalism very urgently right now needs a massive intervention by the government. It is impossible, so long as this is the case, and so long as it is obviously the case, for a neoliberal ideology about private efficiency and private markets producing optimum outcomes. You say that now in the United States, and people look at you as if you were crazy. The only place where that can still fly is in those economics departments that have ringed around themselves a very high wall to pretend that all of what I just described is not happening. And the number of departments that can do that is shrinking every day. But nowhere else does that exist. What instead is happening very quickly is a notion of how and why Keynesian economics. And what do I mean by that? Monetary policy, simple. Increasing the quantity of money and lowering the interest rate, or some combination. Fiscal policy, and what do I mean by that? Spending government money or lowering taxes, either one or both. And regulating private enterprise. That's it. That will solve the problem. We will fix our capitalist economy by a combination of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and regulation. So I want to turn to that because I want to make a critique of the sudden renewed interest in the classic notions of Keynesian economics. So let me turn to that, which is the focus of what I want to do today. First, Keynesian economics has been stunningly unsuccessful historically in getting economies that are in deep recession out of it. It's really important that you understand that, lest you fall for the notion that this has a long history of working. It doesn't. Let me give you the prime example, at least for us in the United States. In the 1930s, we had the last great economic collapse. It begins in October of 1929. Eventually, the Roosevelt government, Franklin Roosevelt, begins to use what we would now call monetary and fiscal policy and regulation to try to get the American economy out of the Great Depression. But the reality is, he couldn't do it. He used many more tools than Mr. Obama is using, the same ones, but even more of them, and it didn't work. That's why the Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1939, 10 years. It wasn't until 1941 that the employment level of 1929 was brought back. And what did it in those last 2 years, between 39 and 49, was not Keynesian economics. It wasn't monetary policy, it wasn't fiscal policy, and it wasn't regulation. It was World War II. The United States took half the unemployed people and put them in a uniform. That made them feel better. It took the other half of the unemployed people and put them in factories to make the uniforms and the guns and the bullets and the planes. That's what solved it. So if this is an example of massive use of Keynesian economics, which it was, and of Keynesian policy, which it was stunningly unsuccessful. Number two, every president of the United States who has been president during an economic downturn, which means almost all our presidents, since capitalism is an extraordinarily unstable system, as I assume you all know. Every 4 or 5 years, capitalism has a downturn. I want to stress that for a moment. If you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you'd either move out or demand that they get professional help. But you don't seem to reason like that in terms of your economic system, and you ought to wonder why. But I'll have a solution for that a little later. Every president who has been in an economic downturn has made a promise when he has applied Keynesian economics. Kennedy did, Eisenhower did, Nixon did, and so on. Here's the promise. My policies, economic, fiscal, monetary, and regulation, will not only get us out of this crisis, but, here comes the big point, it will prevent future crises. On that standard, every president of the United States has been a liar, because not one of them has ever delivered on that promise. That's why we're in such a crisis now. So the idea that Keynesian economics can get you out of one or will prevent the next one is not believable, and ought to make those who are endorsing it again worried. And here's the third basic critique, if you like, of Keynesian economics. It is, and has built into it, self-destruction. It's a peculiar policy that negates itself. Some of you will recognize that the notion of negating oneself shouldn't come difficult to a Marxist. It's a heritage from Hegel, who worked that out for us. How does it work with Keynesian economics? Really simple. What Keynesian economics does is basically impose on corporations, more or less,